Hi. Today is chapter 3 of Tao Te Ching, Removing Desire. If talent is not glorified, people will not compete with one another. If the rare and precious are not coveted, people will not steal. If desirable objects are not wantonly displayed, people's hearts will not be in turmoil. When the enlightened man orders things, he bestows a mind empty of needless concerns, a stomach full of nourishing food. He eschews selfish resolve and strengthens the body. As a guiding principle, he removes the opportunities for willfulness and covetousness from the ordinary people, and withholds the opportunities for misusing their knowledge from the educated. In doing by not doing, there is nothing that cannot be controlled. So I suppose I'd like to take a look at what this really means, or at least my interpretation of it. So the first line, if talent is not glorified, people will not compete with one another. This seems fairly straightforward. You compete because you want recognition for some kind of talent that you have that you believe either no one else does or you are the best at in the world, or at the very least in your particular culture. If the rare and precious are not coveted, people will not steal. Also true. However, I do think it's a bit dangerous to not have things that you find to be rare and precious as well. If you were to say we can get rid of theft by simply not considering anything to be rare and precious, it's not necessarily true. Some people steal because they've got nothing better to do with their time. They have some kind of a disorder. And beyond that, even if they didn't, do you really want to be in a place that has nothing rare or precious at all? That's nihilism. So I suppose with this line, the real contentious issue is not with things that are rare or precious, but with coveting. And without looking it up, I'm just going to say my own personal definition of coveting, which is this idea that you want something that someone else has, you don't have the ability to get it for yourself, and you refuse to move forward. You refuse to move on to something else. You stay obsessed with the thing that you don't have, and that's when you covet. And so, in order to avoid coveting, under that definition, you have to first recognize when you've lost, and you must also have the ability to move on from a loss and not obsess over it or stay focused on it. And that way you can avoid stealing to satisfy that. If desirable objects are not wantonly displayed, people's hearts will not be in turmoil. This seems to be the same issue as the previous line. Those that display desirable objects, they're being boastful. And boastfulness by itself is not necessarily a problem, unless, of course, you're boasting to somebody who is covetous. if you boast to somebody who is not covetous, that person should be able to be happy for you, for the things that you've achieved or the things that you've obtained, if it really brings you happiness. Now, if your happiness doesn't come from sharing your experiences, but instead comes from simply being boastful, like boastfulness for the sake of boastfulness, that's a problem unto itself. Arguably just as bad as covetousness. But I don't necessarily agree that displaying, let's say a trophy, for example, displaying a trophy should always be looked at as boastful. They say you should take pride in your work, although that wasn't said here in the Tao. But I wonder what the Tao would say about taking pride in your work, because some of these lines here seem to be against even admitting that you've taken part in a work. Looking back to the previous chapter for just a brief moment, there is a line in chapter 2 that states, achieves but does not linger to be recognized. So, and the following line after that as well, in not seeking recognition, his credit becomes enduring. So perhaps the Tao is simply saying that if you make something, it should always be anonymous, as to avoid the pitfalls of ego. I wonder if that's the only way to avoid the pitfalls of ego. Or if there might be some other solution that's a bit more nuanced. To be frank, giving up all credit in an effort to give up all covetousness and boastfulness seems like an all or nothing sort of answer. There's no nuance to it, no subtlety to it. The world is not full of people who are thieves and people who are obscure, people who are anonymous, and people who are boastful. There are people in the middle. And at the very least, we haven't yet seen the Tao's attempt at explaining those that lie in the middle of those two. At least I haven't seen it yet. Moving on. When the enlightened man orders things, he bestows a mind empty of needless concerns, a stomach full of nourishing food. He eschews selfish resolve and strengthens the body. When the enlightened man, so this is the man that we should aspire to be, orders things, he bestows a mind empty of needless concerns. So when you are the man you're supposed to be, according to the Tao, and you order things, I wonder if this means of others. If you order things of others, he bestows a mind empty of needless concerns. So you are with those that, with the ones that you, what's the word I'm looking for here? It's not direct. It's, although I suppose direct could be delegate, maybe. When you delegate, I suppose you could argue that this is saying that you empty your mind of the concern because you've delegated the concern to someone else. Although that may not be what it's saying. A stomach full of nourishing food. I feel like this is largely figurative or metaphorical. You become nourished, almost maybe spiritually, by emptying your mind of needless concerns. But it seems to be saying the way to do that is to offload your concerns onto others as orders or directives. In other words, tell somebody else what to do in order to remove that concern from yourself. He eschews, that might be a bit of a strange interpretation. He eschews selfish resolve and strengthens the body. Eschews selfish resolve. Never really thought of resolve as selfish. And strengthening the body, that's definitely not figurative. So, if there's one thing I could take away from this line, it is when the mind is clear, the body will also be strengthened. But I am not going to lie, there's a bunch of parts of that that are very contradictory and seem to be very reductive, to say the least. As a guiding principle, he removes the opportunities for willfulness and covetousness from the ordinary people, and withholds the opportunities for misusing their knowledge from the educated. I see. So as a guiding principle, this is the enlightened man. He removes opportunities for willfulness and covetousness from the ordinary people. So, honestly, that sounds kind of malicious. You're removing other people's opportunities to have their own will exerted in an effort to avoid having covetousness, and you withhold the opportunities for misusing their knowledge from the educated. So, educate people, but don't allow them to exercise that education in a way you disagree with. And remove the opportunity for others to exert their will because they might misuse it. Not gonna lie, the enlightened man is starting to sound kind of tyrannical in how enlightened he is compared to the average man. In doing by not doing, there is nothing that cannot be controlled. And that almost seals it right there. I mean, what other way is there to interpret that but to say a master of those who studied chapter 2 and those who study chapter 3, combining 2 and 3 together, those guiding principles, if you were a master of both, you could control everything. But it's not talking about controlling yourself. Well, I mean, it is, but it's also talking about controlling others, which is, I'm just going to say abhorrent. That's a terrible thing to try to do. If people want to follow your example, that should be something they choose for themselves. But it seems like chapter 3 is saying it's your duty as enlightened to make others enlightened as well. Enlightenment is not a choice, because the alternative is chaos, covetousness. It would be almost like saying we have to force people not to use certain language, because if we don't force them to use certain language, they might say something mean. That's ridiculous. And I'm For the first time reading this book, I mean, we're only in chapter 3, but for the first time reading this book, I'm finding that to be very, like, the interpretations that I'm getting from this, the only way that I can really wrap my head around what's being said is, these are very negative terms here. Maybe I don't see it the way that it's meant to be seen. But there's also a possibility that I am seeing it the way that it's meant to be seen, considering some interpretations of the Tao are meant for political aspirations. If we go back to the preface, I don't know if I read this in its entirety. But under interpreting the Tao Te Ching, it says, the text contains specific instructions and admonitions of such a ruler, which are dictated by and dependent on the overarching mystic cosmology. It can be seen as a work of socio-political philosophy, possibly written specifically as guidance for the ruler of a small to medium-sized state. So, if you're taking this as less philosophical and less, as I said, there's multiple interpretations of the Tao, but if you're taking it as the less philosophical and less mystical, and more so the political, that's authoritarian. Chapter 3 is approval of authoritarian states in order to quell undesirable outcomes among the people who aren't the ruling class. That's quite grotesque, to be honest. But it is open to interpretation. You don't have to interpret it as the political interpretation. You could interpret it any number of ways. The image I'm looking at here, the caption says, leaning on a staff for support, a gentleman pauses on a mountain path to gaze into a misty void. Ink on paper, 1660s. You know, the only thing that really comes to mind looking at this is quaint. And perhaps old. All right. Next time, chapter 4. And I hope everybody who's listening is doing well.